everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started now, right at the hour. My name is Isa Camarillo, and I am the Research Director at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Before we begin, please note that Spanish interpretation is available. Please refer to the instructions on how to access it in the chat. Antes de comenzar, quisiera hacer mención que tenemos interpretación en español disponible. Por favor, vean las instrucciones en el chat para obtener acceso. Okay, this event is particularly important because we are coming together at a critical moment. As Immigrant Heritage Month draws to a close, communities across the country are facing a troubling escalation in ICE raids, detentions, and deportations. Native Americans and permanent residents and even US citizens have been unjustly detained and even deported. These aggressive enforcement actions are driven by Trump's xenophobic rhetoric and policies that portray migration from Latin America as a spontaneous border crisis. But what these tactics actually reveal is a deeper systemic issue. And today we want to highlight a truth that is often obscured in the political discourse, that migration is not the crisis. It is in fact a predictable consequence of trade policies that were designed to serve corporate interest at the expense of human dignity. And for decades, US trade agreements have displaced millions from their homes, and our broken immigration system then facilitates their exploitation when they seek refuge in the United States. At every stage of their journey, migrants are criminalized, detained, and exploited by corporations. Many vital US industries depend on their cheap, vulnerable labor, while private prison companies profit from ICE's detention quotas. That's why Public Citizen and the National Partnership for New Americans are proud to launch a report today that explains precisely how these US trade and immigration policies perpetuate this harmful cycle. The report weaves together powerful stories from agricultural workers, climate refugees, and communities fleeing Central America after brutal US military intervention. We've assembled an exceptional panel for you today to help us explore these critical issues, including Representative Greg Casar from Texas, as well as experts from the National Partnership for New Americans, the United Auto Workers, and CHIRLA, California's leading immigrant rights organization. With that said, it is my distinct honor to introduce Congresswoman Linda Sanchez, who proudly represents California's 38th Congressional District in Los Angeles, an area that is at the heart of these aggressive ICE raids. As the ranking member of the Trade Subcommittee of the influential House Ways and Means Committee, Congresswoman Sanchez has been a steadfast advocate for immigrants' rights and trade reforms to uplift communities and workers. Congresswoman Sanchez, thank you for joining us today.
Okay, there we go. A little bit of technical difficulty. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to join you today, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Linda Sanchez. And as was said in my introduction, I am the ranking member, that means the top Democrat on the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. And it's particularly important that we're coming together to discuss this report from Public Citizen and NPNA. Because it highlights the reality that too many working families already understand and are living. And that is that for decades, our trade policies have been a zero-sum game that benefits corporations while it displaces workers. That approach not only hurt American workers, but it also uprooted communities across Latin America as well. So there is plenty of pain to go around. Agreements like NAFTA and CAFTA-DR were supposed to bring shared prosperity for the US and for our trading partners in Latin and Central America. But sadly, instead of shared prosperity, this approach has yielded worse conditions for workers in both countries, economic insecurity for workers in both countries, and a more informal migration sort of pattern that has resulted. In Mexico, millions of farmers lost their livelihoods due to NAFTA, and those sadly weren't unforeseen consequences. It's what many people, many of us, were warning would happen at the time that the agreement was entered into. So I've served in Congress. I've been honored to serve in Congress since 2003, And I voted against CAFTA-DR and all of the US trade agreements that were negotiated with South American countries for exactly those reasons. We have to rethink how we do trade, and we have to chart a new direction. Our trade policy has to help address the root causes of migration by empowering communities in Latin American countries and elsewhere. And that is a big piece that is missing from our trade agreement template. That means ending things like forced labor, raising international labor standards, and supporting pro-worker policies. And the USMCA was a step in the right direction. During Trump's first administration, after the Democrats had regained control of the House in the midterms, we told President Trump that the new NAFTA, because they were upgrading the NAFTA agreement, they were renegotiating it. We said that the new NAFTA that he had negotiated with House Republicans was just not good enough. And Democrats were not going to support it if it didn't improve labor and environmental standards, increase access to medicines, and close some of the enforcement loopholes that existed. And Trump tried to push back against that, but Democrats, we created a facility-specific labor enforcement mechanism called the Rapid Response Mechanism that has delivered real gains for over 40,000 workers in Mexico. And Democrats were only in a position to make these demands because we knew at the time that President Trump was going to need congressional votes to approve his updated NAFTA. In Trump's attempt to circumvent Congress and to be the sole arbiter of US trade policy, we are witnessing an assault on the constitutional norms that guide congressional leadership on trade since America's founding. The Constitution grants to Congress the power to levy tariffs and taxes, not the president. But President Trump has sort of reached beyond what limited powers he has in the trade space, and he has just gone completely, overboard with his overreach of power in setting tariffs. We are in a position now where we are looking to the USMCA review that is going to happen next year. And one of the things I have to say is that I'm really concerned that Congress is not even going to have the opportunity to weigh in to make the needed improvements to USMCA because Trump seems hell-bent on negotiating trade agreements with other countries without seeking congressional approval. And again, in the Constitution, that is our jurisdiction. So at this point, it's pretty unclear whether the Trump administration is going to push for the necessary improvements to the agreement, to the USMCA agreement. Instead, they sort of seem to be chasing short-term headlines rather than working out meaningful reforms to our trade policies. And that includes the president's obsession with tariffs and his unrealistic promise to negotiate 90 trade deals in 90 days. There just simply isn't enough time. It's been nearly 3 months since his so-called Liberation Day, and we have at best half an agreement to swap UK luxury cars for American cows. That seems to be the big, crowning achievement that his negotiations have gotten. The Trump administration really, in my opinion, seems to be using these so-called trade negotiations to actually just shake down our trading partners, to enrich President Trump, his family, and the special interests that are closest to the administration. His extortionist approach to these negotiations are not going to rebalance trade in a way that is fair. And his broad-based tariffs are only going to make both countries poorer. So that's not to say that tariffs can't be a powerful tool when they are used in a targeted way and they are paired with things like good industrial policy and investments in facilities and in workforce development for workers. But instead, Trump seems to be using tariffs as weapons to advance a broader xenophobic agenda, because Trump's anti-immigrant agenda isn't just reflected in what we're seeing in US cities across the country. And my district has been particularly hard hit by these immigration raids. But his anti-immigrant agenda is really showing up in his trade policy as well. I want to give you one specific example to highlight this. Look at Colombia. Trump threatened a 25% tariff unless Colombia agreed to accept a military deportation flight. And this was all because the Colombian president had the decency to ask that migrants be returned with dignity, not in shackles as if they were criminals. But Trump's lack of humanity doesn't end there. Whether or not Mexico should accept migrants who were born in other countries is a major negotiating point right now in the trade talks between President Sheinbaum and Trump. In my humble opinion, sending people to a country that is not where they were born is not just absurd, but it's just draconian. It's just cruel. We are talking about people who have lived in the United States, some for over a decade or decades, and know the United States as the only country that is their home. I want to point out another example. If you look at South Africa, the Trump administration cut off all aid, claiming that there were quote unquote massive human rights violations against white farmers. And this was in retaliation against a new land reform law that was actually trying to correct apartheid era inequality. So South Africa was trying to correct this inequality against the Black population. No land had even been seized under the law, but Trump was saying that there were massive human rights violations against the poor white farmers. And in response, Trump and his administration launched a trade war against South Africa using racial fear and misinformation, I mean, flat out misinformation as a justification for that trade war. So we have to stop and ask ourselves, who are his trade policies really working for? Because if they only protect corporations, if they widen inequality, and if they ignore human rights, then they're really not serving American interests. Instead of reforming our trade policies and improving our national security and our trust with other countries, Trump has exacerbated economic pressures abroad while targeting immigrants to appeal to his MAGA base. The fact is, shutting down all legal pathways, as this administration has done, doesn't manage our borders. It fails to manage our borders. It doesn't make any sense, and it's just cruel. So we need to engage Latin American countries by elevating pro-labor, environmental, and indigenous rights policies. Our trade agenda should be a critical role in doing just that. I have spent the past 20 years working on comprehensive immigration reform, always believing that we must address the root causes of migration, or we are always going to have people showing up at the southern border. And this report today makes it clear. It's time for a new chapter in our trade policy. We can do better, and we must do better, because trade should lift all workers up, not leave them behind. Trade should help address those root causes of migration, not contribute to it. And trade should reflect our democratic values, not betray them. So that's just some of my thoughts on trade and where we need to be focused in the months and the years ahead. And again, I want to thank everybody who's joined us today on this call.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for those powerful remarks. I'm going to move on by explaining a little bit about the report. As we just heard, the situation we face is very, very urgent. And the report that we're launching today provides critical insights into how free trade agreements, particularly NAFTA and CAFTA, have fueled forced migration for decades. These agreements promised prosperity, but they were not designed to support workers or foster stability. Instead, they were crafted to deregulate markets and protect corporate interest and undermine national sovereignty in Latin America. And the workers across the borders felt these impacts very, very quickly. In the United States, manufacturing hubs in industrial cities like Detroit were hollowed out, well-paying union jobs disappeared, and that devastated the working class communities. In Latin America, the economic conditions were already quite fragile, and so the consequences were even more profound, as NAFTA and CAFTA required Mexico and Central American countries to dismantle vital protections for their local agriculture, including tariffs, local procurement rules, and Mexico's communal land system known as ejidos, which were vital to the small farmers. And consequently, the US subsidized agribusiness, which flooded the local markets, further harming the small farmers, putting them out of business. And in contrast, the promised jobs the promised jobs never materialized. Instead, what happened was that poverty deepened, the inequality grew, and millions of people were forced to migrate simply to survive. And the problem didn't stop there. The extractive industries intensified displacement by polluting water sources, destroying forests, and rendering farmland unusable across Mexico and Central America. And NAFTA and CAFTA explicitly promoted this race to the bottom, as we've called it. They did not contain meaningful labor or environmental protections. So that allowed corporations to move freely across borders in search of the lowest wages and the weakest environmental regulations. And so many of the jobs that were initially created by these agreements quickly relocated to even lower wage countries. Yet, instead of addressing these root causes, what we have seen politicians do is to exploit migration for political gain. For decades, migrants have been recruited to the US when economically convenient and then criminalized when it was politically expedient. This exploitation has reached dangerous new heights under President Trump, as he has labeled migration from Latin America as an invasion and asylum seekers as criminals. Trump is justifying increased border militarization, family separation, mass detention, and deportation, while simultaneously reinforcing the very trade policies that drive migration. Even more troubling is how corporations are profiting at every stage of this crisis. First, they exploit land and labor in Latin America, and then they rely on vulnerable migrant workers within the United States. And then private prisons profit from the ICE detention quotas, which creates a lucrative cycle of displacement and detention. So if anything, it's clear that the real crisis is not at the border, it's just corporate greed. And the narrative that migrants steal jobs or drain resources is deliberately deceptive. In fact, the industries that profit from migrant labor often spend millions of dollars lobbying for restrictive immigration policies. That way they can maintain workers' vulnerability. And Trump exploited the genuine frustration among US workers harmed by trade agreements by campaigning against NAFTA, but failing to deliver meaningful change. Instead, he weaponized trade policy to bully other countries and enrich corporations and undermine workers' rights across borders, reinforcing the same model that fuels forced migration. But to further unpack these dynamics, I'd like to welcome Nicole Malacu, the Executive Director of NPNA and our co-convener for this event. Nicole will share insights into how the current immigration policies continue to penalize displaced migrants.
Thank you so much, Isa, for this invitation and for our partnership in releasing this report. As Isa mentioned, my name is Nicole Malacu. I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the National Partnership for New Americans. We are a multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition of 88 of the nation's largest immigrant and refugee advocacy organizations with reach across 42 states that work together to advance immigrant equity and inclusion. Along with Public Citizen, we're so pleased to present this report today at a very timely moment in the conversation on immigration and global trade. This report truly provides a progressive framework to counter the anti-immigrant narratives that we are seeing today and really highlights the way that migration continues to be weaponized as a societal burden when in fact the issue is exploited to drive profit on the backs of immigrant communities as part of an unjust larger system that creates insurmountable obstacles to fulfill the full realization of racial, economic, and civic inclusion of immigrants and refugees in this country. Our vision as the National Partnership for New Americans is one where all people, regardless of their immigration status, have the opportunity to access equitable opportunities, live free of fear, and are supported in their journey to fulfill inclusion as they thrive in the communities they call home. Our members, as Representative Sanchez mentioned, including Chirola in Los Angeles, have been at the front lines of fighting for immigrant justice and protection in this era of mass enforcement, criminalization, and the disappearance of people across communities. Every day, we are seeing attacks on undocumented individuals and long-term residents, while our government continues to fund a deeply flawed and unjust enforcement apparatus and continues to engage in failed trade policies. This larger threat includes racial profiling and extends to anyone who is Black, Brown, Indigenous, or multi-generation ethnically diverse diaspora, regardless of their citizenship. All this while addressing the root causes of migration, and solutions are brushed under the rug to avoid accountability and continue to deny the urgent need for immigration reform. Our report today highlights the U.S. responsibility in stabilizing communities abroad and domestically. Throughout history, people have come to the United States seeking safety and better opportunities. They settled, revitalized diverse communities, building workforce of key industries in agriculture, construction, healthcare, hospitality, and beyond our contributions to the economy, we are worthy of dignity, protection, and the freedom to move and the freedom to return as part of the human experience. Since January, as we've all mentioned, we've seen targeted ICE enforcement at construction sites, farms, and service industries during workplace raids. And we are seeing the fear that enforcement brings to communities, but also eroding the economic stability of immigrant families here in the United States that often include U.S. citizens. Even more troubling is the capitulation of corporations who continue to hide behind the political football of immigration, shielding themselves from their role in labor exploitation. And just a few weeks ago, multi-conglomerate corporations and billionaires began to urge Trump to pause deportations for the agriculture and leisure business until known white nationalist Stephen Miller urged the administration to circle back within days to continue massive enforcement in overreach through raids across the country. I name this because at the heart of the matter is the fact that this is about profit over people. Our report uncovers failed international trade policy and immigration policy that go hand in hand with what we're seeing today. Dating back to the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, IRA, in 1996, to today's anti-immigrant executive actions, legislation, and federal budget funneling to massive investments to harmful enforcement mechanisms are part of this conversation and part of the active stripping of legal protections and the ability to help people regularize status through a fair and humane process. The obstacles are clearly a lack of infrastructure and resources to help support undocumented communities regularize status, and have led to the continued exploitation of immigrants whose labor supports vital industries and who throughout history have addressed major labor shortages throughout history, regardless of economic conditions in the United States. I say this because this story is personal to me. As thousands of Mexican workers came to the U.S. as non-immigrant laborers under the Bracero program during World War II, our country then went on to target immigrant workers through deportation programs, such as the known, and I really hate this word, the name of that program, Operation Wetback. Later in 1996, the Immigration Reform and Naturalization Act then carried out sanctions against employers for hiring undocumented workers, and then at the same time allowed certain undocumented immigrants to legalize their status, including my grandfather, who came to this country in the late 1940s, early 1950s as a bracero, as part of that program, and came to the United States, to New Mexico and Colorado, to pick chilies and potatoes, and then was toggling between being welcomed and being sent back during that time. I'm the proud daughter of an immigrant woman who naturalized naturalized and granddaughter of a bracero who came during that program and who was able to regularize their status because of IRCA. And so I stand here today with us reminding ourselves that we don't need federal investment to criminalize undocumented workers. What we need are lawful pathways that uphold the safety and dignity and rights of immigrants and their families. Our report highlights the fact that democracy, a functioning democracy, does not exist without immigrant justice. We see daily in our work nationally and along with some of our international partners how trade policy and immigration policies are used to foster industries that are ripe with worker exploitation. Our government has become very comfortable with the status quo while we see peaceful civilians take to the streets to interrupt the authoritarian playbook. This report focuses on Latin America, and the recommendations we offer are for systemic changes that should act as a framework for helping welcome immigrants and migrants, regardless of where they come from or what drove their journeys. We must act together to expand legal pathways for vulnerable populations, including parole, humanitarian parole, temporary protected status, and refugee resettlement programs to offer relief to vulnerable populations seeking safety and security. I'm named this because the Trump administration has ended resettlement at this point and ended termination of parole programs that are providing vital protections for almost 500,000 people. I also want to name the fact that the bans on individuals from Muslim majority countries, African and Asian countries, are deeply troubling to us as a network, as it's part of this larger apparatus to create instability abroad and then not be willing to reckon with the outcome of failed international trade policy. Together with our members and many of you on this call today, we vehemently stand to oppose anti-immigrant bills and the funding that supports the mechanism to criminalize marginalized community and undermine worker rights. Instead, we reaffirm our protection for immigrants facing exploitation and abuse, both domestically and abroad. We really want to see our members of Congress continue to advocate for visas for immigrant victims of crime, trafficking, and worker exploitation that would provide vital pathways to residency, protection, and authorization for work permits for individuals who are part and parcel of critical industries in the United States economy. We are also wanting to underscore the fact that the denial of constitutional protections, such as due process, is unlawful. And instead of kidnapping and disappearing our communities, we need our government to be investing in representation so individuals have access to due process and their fair day in court. And again, I urge all of us to continue fighting for a pathway to citizenship for undocumented farm workers, dreamers, and long-term residents. On the slide is the story of Jorge that you will see shortly. And Jorge is from Jalisco, Mexico in the United States and shares a bit of his story here that you will be able to see, and I will read it shortly. And if you could please put up the slide, Isa, that would be great. So Jorge is a dreamer, as I mentioned, and experienced firsthand the injustices from worsening climate change and the criminalization of the immigration system. Climate change has affected the water supply and stability of weather patterns of small farmers like his family, and that they depend on to sustain themselves. Without the resources to overcome those impacts, they are forced to migrate to the United States and work for giant agricultural corporations without protections or legal status. We must fulfill our shared responsibility in global climate change and adaptation to disaster response if we want to acknowledge our role in heightening global insecurity. In closing, we must exhaust all legal and political avenues to protect legal pathways, lawful pathways for immigrants from further attacks. Together with all of you, our members of Congress, our allies, we can advance immigrant and refugee equity, inclusion, and build safe pathways and access to legal representation and due process, and the full inclusion of our immigrant diaspora. In collaboration with Public Citizen, This is one way that we together say that we can address the root causes for much needed and long overdue systemic policy change for global trade and migration. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nicole, for that powerful perspective. The intersection between immigration policy and trade is such a critical issue, and we must ensure that both migrant and labor rights are prioritized in any policy reform moving forward. Next, we're going to hear from Chris Satratz, the legislative representative of the United Auto Workers, who will discuss the specific impact of trade policies on workers in the United States and abroad.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Isa and Public Citizen, for the fantastic report and for providing an opportunity for the UAW to join this great panel. I work in the UAW's legislative department, where I primarily handle a portfolio for issues impacting our members in auto and other manufacturing sectors. The UAW represents nearly 1 million active and retired members. Our members work all across the manufacturing sector, from auto and auto parts to heavy truck, agricultural implement, aerospace, and more. In the short time I have, I am hoping to provide some perspective into how our country's trade agreements and free trade policy have impacted workers both in the US and abroad. For UAW members and for many, many workers, trade policy isn't abstract. It impacts nearly every aspect of our work, from our pay, working hours, and it often determines whether our plants get investment or even remain open. Trade is really a bread and butter issue, and for far too long, free trade policy has been a disaster for UAW members and for workers everywhere. Every time our union sits down with an employer in a new organizing campaign or to negotiate a new contract, the number one threat they throw at us and our members, the number one scare tactic, the number one reason workers often don't stand up for themselves and to raise wages or conditions for workers everywhere, is because of the threat that an employer will offshore their jobs. For that reason, most workers know our trade policy to really be a tool for the boss. And that has been the reality for workers going back several decades. After enactment of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the US lost over 5 million manufacturing jobs, over 90,000 plants were closed, and wages for auto workers both in the US and Mexico have fallen. The big three US automakers alone have closed over 65 plants in the last 20 years. And at the time, the UAW was sounding the alarm on NAFTA, arguing that it would not translate into higher living standards for workers. And decades later, we've seen multinational corporations locate in Mexico and develop a substantial export economy that is based on poverty wages. For instance, a UAW member at a GM truck plant in Indiana earns over $30 an hour, while a worker building the exact same truck in Mexico earns just $3 an hour. That is how trade policy pits workers against each other. Free trade policy drives a race to the bottom, to the benefit of corporations and to the detriment of workers. And the USMCA, the Trump's NAFTA 2.0, as we call it, hasn't stopped the bleeding. Despite the agreement's novel labor provisions that Representative Sanchez mentioned, wages in Mexico remain criminally low, and UAW members continue to fight against the offshoring of their jobs and the closing of their plants. Just last year, Stellantis laid off over 1,000 UAW members before announcing that it was moving production of the Ram truck to Mexico. Now, the price of that truck won't go down, and the wages that are paid by that company in Mexico won't go up. Instead, company executives and shareholders will pocket that difference, while workers in the US and Mexico suffer the consequences. We believe at the UAW that instead of being collateral damage, workers need to be the primary focus of our trade policy. That's why the upcoming review of the USMCA is really high stakes for UAW members. Because of the harm that workers continue to experience as a result of the trade agreement, but also because of the fracture in the free trade system that this moment could represent, we believe that we have an opportunity to chart a new course and reverse the damage of our broken trade policies. And we can do this by making substantial changes to that agreement to support workers everywhere. One way to do this, and a major change that we are advocating for, is the establishment of a manufacturing minimum wage in Mexico, so that corporations can no longer force workers to accept less. Our trade agreements should demand that they provide a wage that all workers can live on. Now, that will be a tall task. I think we know that industry and many elected leaders will say that raising wages and labor standards is going to be too disruptive, right? But I think what I appreciate most about ISA's report is just how it illustrates for workers the status quo. Our current free trade policy is incredibly disruptive. To many, when working class people suffer for decades, it's considered just the cost of doing business. And when Wall Street and wealthy corporations are finally held accountable, then it's considered a crisis. I think, as is evident in this report, and to everyone on this panel, and to workers here and abroad, we are in a crisis, and we cannot afford to continue down this free trade disaster that exploits workers everywhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris, for your wonderful insights into the labor issues within the framework of trade agreements. It is clear that any trade policy moving forward must go hand in hand with labor protections to prevent further exploitation. And now we'll hear from Junwen Trujillo, the Director of Workers' Rights and the Labor Legal Services at the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, better known as CHIRLA, who will share personal stories from the front lines of this fight and highlight the real-world human cost of these policies on immigrant communities here in the United States.
Thank you, Isa. So as many of you know, in Los Angeles County and beyond in Southern California, we have been dealing with the militarization of immigration enforcement, where masked unidentified agents are racially profiling and unconstitutionally arresting workers who have been living in the US for 30 or 40 years. And so many of you might ask yourselves, why didn't you get papers during that time, right? So for almost 40 years, we have not had any meaningful immigration reform. In January of 2023, recently, the Biden administration had created a program called the Deferred Action for Labor Enforcement, also known as DALE, which what it did, similar to a U visa, is that if a worker was the victim of labor abuse, which could be wage theft, discrimination, or retaliation, they could be granted protection from deportation because, similar to a U visa, they're witnesses in the labor investigation. But it was not required that they actually be witnesses, but that was the general idea. Now, fast forward to today, the program still exists in paper, but it is practically non-existent because a lot of the applications, the great majority, have been stalled since January of 2025. Now, some of my clients are LA garment workers who, instead of being paid minimum wage, they were paid by the piece produced, and they often earned less than the required minimum wage. They were not paid overtime wages, and because they're paid dependent on production, they were encouraged not to take breaks. Other clients of mine worked in the poultry industry. They were displaced workers. They were displaced by trade policies in their home country, came to the US to work in the poultry industry, where they suffered similar abuses. In the poultry industry, we also saw Guatemalan children as young as 14 years old who didn't speak English or Spanish being forced to work up to 60 hours per week, child labor, using sharp tools in a high-risk job. So as you can tell, the DALE program had a lot of potential because, in case you didn't know, Wage theft is the highest form of theft in our country. So nationally, the estimate is 50 billion per year. That's the amount of wage theft, which far surpasses losses from robberies and burglaries and car theft combined. And nationally, about 17% of low-wage workers suffer wage theft, but in LA County, that number goes up to 88%. And the number is much higher because we have a high concentration of displaced immigrant workers who often don't know that employment law protects them as well, regardless of status. And we have an entire economic system taking advantage of that. Now, in the cases that I mentioned earlier, the labor agencies, the U.S. Department of Labor, the California Labor Commissioner's Office, they did their job, they investigated, and this happened before DALE was even created. But DALE gave immigrant workers an extra sense of security. So what does this mean for workers and trade policy? In California, foreign-born workers make up 1/3 of the state's total workforce. And in other areas, the percentage is higher. So this shift in immigration policy enforcement is no coincidence. It is not just about racism. It is designed to weaken workers' rights and dissent at home. Because when you weaken immigrant rights, you weaken workers' rights. By silencing immigrant workers through these worker dissent, through fear, through surveillance, through violence, through threats of deportation, and weakening due process for immigrants, this administration is serving corporate interests at home, many of those same corporate interests that it has been serving abroad. So please understand that, again, the current attack on immigrants, it is not just about racism, it's about weakening workers' rights at home. And when trade policies prioritize corporate profits, the only way to bring jobs back, as this administration claims it wants to do, is by undermining labor protections at home so corporations can continue reaping record profits at the expense of workers. And we must not allow that to happen. Both domestic and international policies must include strong worker protections and high labor standards, as well as immigration protections. And to end this section, I just want to say one thing and kind of root this in a reality, which is this is an issue that concerns all of us. I always tell people I spoke with, go and look in your closet today. The clothes that you're wearing, they might have been made in Honduras or Mexico or Jordan or other countries by exploited hands. And if you take pride in buying clothes made in America, there's an 83% chance that those garments were made in Los Angeles by the same displaced immigrant workers who are being targeted today. So in a globalized economy, global labor abuse is not someone else's concern because every injustice against workers is interconnected. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that powerful story, Junuen. We must never lose sight of the real people behind every statistic, because these are people whose lives are shaped by these policies. So unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time to get into a Q&A, but there seems to be a common thread among the questions that were being asked. So I'll just pause now to answer one of those questions. Let me see here. So it's essentially, given that trade agreements fall under Congress's purview, what obstacles do you foresee in exercising oversight, and do you see potential for advancing new trade directions under the current administration and USTR? And I just like to say that many members of Congress, including the two that we have here with us today, have been doing everything they can to push back on Trump's authoritarian and pro-billionaire trade agenda and to articulate an alternative vision. Nearly 700 organizations and dozens of House members have issued detailed demands on what needs to change in the USMCA renegotiation. But there are too many in Congress who are willing to rubber stamp whatever the president wants, even if they disagree with it. For example, when Democrats submitted legislation to end the emergency declaration that Trump used to enact reckless tariffs, Republican leadership used a sneaky legislative maneuver to stop a vote from taking place, which would have been politically risky for them. They basically declared that there were no more calendar days left for the particular bill, so no vote could be held. But representatives who actually care about working people are continuing to push, and we need to keep pushing too. Trade is like so many things right now where it's hard to force Trump to do the right thing, but people are standing up, like the 5 million who turned out for No King's Day. And we need to keep that momentum going until we're in a position where we can force the administration's hand. Let me see if there are any other questions. There is a question here that says, is there any way that consumers can push back, hold specific corporations responsible? And I'd like to see if Nicole or Chris or Junwin, would any of you like to take a stab at answering that question?
I can quickly, I am not on camera at this moment, but I think one of the things that you as consumers can do is write letters. Many of us live in states where a major industry is present, whether that's a garment industry or the meat packing industry or agricultural belts of the United States, is to write letters. And also never underestimate your consumer power to shop with and spend your consumer dollars with industries that are really aligned with protecting communities and really urging the administration to look at our foreign policy in a different lens. So both at the individual level and as well as using your voice at the local level to write letters and to call up corporations and ask for accountability for these wayward policies.
Absolutely. And I'll just add that corporations play such an important part in the shaping of these trade policies in the first place. For example, it is a known fact that corporations have access to these trade negotiations, whereas, the everyday person does not. And so we need to keep pushing and lobbying for the everyday people. That way, it's not just the corporations that can ultimately take over and have their way. Chris, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thank you. I think especially for the auto industry, major automakers are very sensitive to consumer sentiment. I think most about Ford, who really brands itself as being made in America and really touts that image. And I think if consumers have an ability to say it's important to us not only where our products are being built, but what kind of standards and wages are being provided to the workers who make those products. I think if you make that known to these major corporations, I think they will listen to that, and because they're sensitive to how consumers are feeling, and ultimately that can have some kind of impact.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you to the audience for asking such insightful questions. We will keep monitoring and answer. And if we don't get to them today, we will certainly follow up via email. Now it is my great privilege to introduce our closing speaker, Congressman Greg Casar. Congressman Casar proudly represents the 35th Congressional District of Texas, which includes the vibrant immigrant communities of Austin and San Antonio, cities deeply affected by the policies that we're discussing today. As chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, he has been a relentless advocate for immigrant justice, workers' rights, and progressive trade policies that prioritize people over profits. Congressman Casar, we are honored to have you with us today to close out this critical conversation.
Hi, all. Good afternoon. Thanks to Public Citizen and the National Partnership for New Americans for putting together this event and this report. As we're all living through right now, Donald Trump on the campaign trail and now as president is constantly blaming immigrants for problems that he and his billionaire buddies themselves have caused and lobbied for and have pushed into law. And the consequences have been devastating for our communities, especially like the communities I represent in Texas. And it's just, we need to be able to call out when it is the arsonists themselves that are calling themselves the firefighters or blaming the firefighters for the flames, because it is not immigrants who signed trade deals that devastated American communities and offshored tons of union jobs. No, it was the billionaire class that did that. It was not immigrants who signed on to trade deals and put in provisions that have been devastating to the local economies of places like Guatemala and Honduras and country after country after country. It was the billionaire class that pushed for those sorts of provisions in our trade deals. And so it's so important for us to call out who the real villains are in our politics and then work on real solutions. That's why pretty soon I will be releasing the Migration Stability Act, which focuses on making sure that we have trade policies that support working class people around the world, and including and especially here in our own country, that we look at the way that we impose debt on other countries and sanction working class people and other places in ways that actually cause a lot of the mass migration that we see throughout the world and in the Western Hemisphere. I have to also recognize here as Progressive Caucus Chair and as a proud Democrat that these are issues that are not just within the Republican Party, but that are too often the billionaire class has had too much influence on Democratic policy on the economy and in our trade deals. It's time for the Democratic Party to become truly a working people's party, a pro-worker party, and an anti-billionaire party. And I think you can see that the effects of not being that highlighted in this report that's been released. We have to recognize that the big industry lobbies that are working to block us from having water break rules for workers in our own country are the same lobbies that are pushing to drive down worker wages and destroy unions in other countries, ultimately causing mass migration and instability and untold suffering in our country and around the world. And so this report that you're releasing and the work that the group here is doing to have trade that is focused on working class people is the right policy, and it's the right kind of politics for our party and for our country. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Congressman Kazar, for your inspiring leadership and powerful vision for systemic reform. I would also like to extend my deepest gratitude to all of the speakers today, as well as to everyone who joined us for this discussion. And special thanks to my legal research interns, Leslie Ortiz and James Paredes, who are in Los Angeles, and who, like me, are first-generation immigrants and whose real-life perspectives were vital to drafting this report. Our report includes detailed policy recommendations in both the trade and immigration spaces. I encourage each of you to read the full report, share its insights widely, and join us in advocating for these essential changes. The report has, the executive summary has been translated into Spanish, and then you can find all of that on the links that have been dropped in the chat. Thank you again for your support, and have an excellent rest of your day.